What does your inner critic sound like? Most of us have a negative critical voice that pops up periodically. In fact, we all have many parts of our personality that represent different and distinct mood states, though we may not consciously be aware of this. Now, this doesn't mean that we have multiple personalities. It's normal for everyone to have many different aspects to themselves. We usually have a playful part, a frightened part that tends to worry, maybe a part that can be obsessive about work, and there can be more. But it's the inner critic that causes a great deal of internal distress, and I'm talking about that today. I'm psychotherapist Shavaun Scott, and on this channel I answer your questions on everything related to psychology, relationships, and mental health. If you enjoy this program, please like it and feel free to subscribe to my channel. I see 5 ways the inner critic tends to show up. The first way it manifests is with perfectionism. The perfectionist sets unrealistic goals and expects the impossible, never able to look at themselves as good enough. They're unsatisfied with their work and often their appearance. They'll pick themselves apart and find the smallest things to criticize, usually things that no one else would notice. Number 2 is that the inner critic magnifies mistakes. Any small error or imperfection that's perfectly normal is seen as a glaring flaw and it's blown out of proportion. And then the inner critic focuses on it and ruminates about it. This can cause a person to feel tormented by their own thoughts, and it's particularly common when people are trying to fall asleep at night, because then they're not distracted by the activities they're engaged in during the day. This is a major factor in insomnia for many people. The next thing the inner critic does is compare us to others. There's always someone smarter, richer, more accomplished, talented, or more attractive. It's as if there's a never-ending scorecard running in our heads, and we never measure up on the achievement bar. Number 4 is that the inner critic tends to blame us for anything negative that happens. It tells us we're at fault for things we had absolutely no control over, and that voice in our head repeatedly tells us, "You should be ashamed of yourself." This sense of shame can permeate our lives and make us absolutely miserable. It's a big factor in depression. Finally, the inner critic causes anxiety that holds us back from trying new things. It tells us that we'll fail before we start because we're never going to be perfect. Good enough is not good enough because the critical voice demands perfection, which is impossible. We can't accept that anything less than that is okay, so we don't even try. And this means that our life becomes smaller than it needs to be, and that we lose out on so many activities that very well could turn out to be wonderful. So how do we work with this? We start with understanding the process and how it developed. Childhood experiences have a great deal to do with our styles of perceiving and thinking after we grow up. We integrate the voices of our parents or caregivers, the things we heard repeated as kids, and this becomes an inner monologue in our heads. If we heard lots of positive and encouraging messages as children, we integrate the positive and encouraging voices, and this influences how we perceive the world as adults. But if we heard lots of negativity and criticism, that's what gets integrated, and it tends to become a huge part of our inner life. These negative perceptions and distorted thoughts become so automatic, we're not even aware that they're not based in reality. Our brains can become our own worst enemy, and we're not even aware that we're doing it to ourselves. Now here's another thing. Criticism is contagious. Maybe the negative messages we heard weren't even directed at us. Maybe our caregivers were frequently criticizing themselves and other people aloud. We see this a lot when a parent constantly voices self-criticism about their weight or appearance or performance in front of their children. The kids pick up and internalize those messages about weight, appearance, and performance and apply it to themselves. I'm often telling parents to stop complaining about themselves or criticizing themselves in other ways in front of their kids. So what do we do about this? Well, we want to start with developing awareness of the critical voice as it's happening. And this goes back to the concept of self-monitoring I always talk about. It's practicing mindfulness. So often this self-criticism happens automatically and we're not consciously even noticing when it's happening, but it's affecting our moods and perceptions. Keeping a daily journal to track repetitive patterns of thoughts and feelings is very helpful. Writing about our inner experience strengthens our ability to observe our own thoughts and notice when they're working to help us and when they aren't. This is a habit we can learn that will serve us in many ways throughout life. Now, people always say, well, this sounds like work. It is, but it's work that will change your life for the better, and so it's worth doing. Another thing that's very helpful is to externalize the voice. Now, this may sound funny at first, but it works. I have my clients create a persona for the inner critic and actually give it a name. You'd be surprised how many people call their inner critic the drill sergeant, an angry, aggressive voice that yells at them in their heads. But it doesn't matter what you call it. The point here is that you begin to see that the inner critic is not something you want to keep integrated as part of yourself. It's not serving you. We want to keep it separate so that you can begin to mute it or turn down the volume. I also help my clients explore the origin of the inner critic by asking, whose voice is it? Most of the time, people can reflect and identify the person or persons who consistently gave them critical messages. After they identify the origin of the voice, it's easier to separate it out from their own thoughts and differentiate reality from the distorted messages from the critic. Again, the origin could have been family members, could even have been a teacher or peers, or sometimes even toxic messages from the media that were internalized, because criticism is contagious. Once you recognize the origin of the voice, it's time to practice challenging what it's saying. That mean voice in your head is feeding you distorted information, and we want to question the evidence rather than accepting it as reality. I have clients write down the negative messages and then write contrasting positive messages that are based in reality. This takes practice, but it gets easy over time. An example might be the voice in your head just saying, you're a loser. And so we contrast that by writing down all the things that you've done well and the fact that you don't need to be perfect. Good enough is good enough. An exercise I walk people through in therapy is to help them develop another part of themselves that will argue with the critical voice and replace the criticism with compassion. My favorite metaphor for this is what I call the older, wiser self. I ask people to imagine an image of who they're going to become in the future when they no longer experience self-criticism. This is a compassionate persona or part that looks at them with insight and affirmation. Since this is an imagination exercise, they can make the older, wiser self anyone. There's no wrong way to imagine. The older, wiser self can be a variation of someone they've known in real life or a fictional character. It doesn't matter. The only thing that's important is that this part is accepting rather than perfectionistic. The older, wiser self doesn't induce shame or blame, and we want this part to dispute what the critical voice says. Disputing messages from the critical voice gets easier over time. It's like turning down the volume on the TV. It gradually gets quieter and less powerful and eventually will fade away. We want it on. When people are struggling with the critical voice in a given situation, I also ask them, what would you say to a friend about this situation? When they think of a friend, they can always identify something encouraging and positive that they'd say. And the goal here is to practice that kind of self-compassion and say those same things to yourself. Eventually, compassion becomes the default as the internal critic is muted. So you can see that self-monitoring is key. Self-monitoring includes keeping track of our patterns and triggers. When does the inner critic pop up? When is it loudest? Are there certain people we interact with who seem to set it off? Is it worse when we're tired, hungry, hormonal, or stressed? All those things are common. And if we understand when we're extra vulnerable, we can plan in advance to use coping skills to keep that inner critic on mute. Now, there are a couple of important caveats here. People who are experiencing major depression or other conditions like some forms of obsessive compulsive disorder often have extreme problems with the inner critic. These are serious mental health conditions that require clinical treatment. Sometimes the inner critic pushes people to think of self-harm. If you're experiencing persistent sadness, a loss of pleasure, a change in your eating or sleeping habits, feelings of constant guilt or worthlessness, a loss of energy, or any thoughts of harming yourself, you need to see a mental health professional. You can call the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline at 988 anytime. So in summary, my general advice is to seek out people and activities you enjoy. Set small goals and practice visualizing that older, wiser, compassionate part of yourself. Speak to yourself as you would to your best friend. And be patient. It takes time, but it gets easier. And please don't ever be afraid to ask for help. Take good care.